good? Perfect. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for week 4 of Reading the Grundrisse with David Harvey. I wanted to give a quick update on book orders. So there's still a huge backup in the factory, in the warehouse with printing the Grundrisse. So we have a bunch of the companions, but the shipments are going out soon for those texts. So thanks so much for your patience. They'll get to you soon, and then for in person, we'll hopefully have them by next week. But there's just a huge backup. So I'm sorry about that, and thanks for your patience. So I just wanted to share that update with you all. So stay tuned, and I'm going to pass it over to David for our class.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, this week and in this section, we hit, I think, a bit of an important transition point, which by accident is associated with the fact that next week we're going to have a sort of book launch for the companion. And of course, I hope you'll all come along. It will be Nancy Fraser coming to talk about her reactions to the text, and Kanishka Gunawardana, who's a geographer from Toronto and who's written extensively about forms of capital and has some interesting comments about totality and the like. He will also be there, so they will be commenting on the text, and I will be responding, and then it will be open to you and the public to go a bit further. So this is sort of an official book launch inserted at this time into the course, so it's sort of in the course but out of the course, if you know what I mean. But also I think that it's useful at this point to take up a couple of general issues about the text. Starting from page 304, he kind of says something rather interesting, which I find useful to keep in mind while reading the rest of the text. Marx talks about the way in which, if at the end of the process of production, which was begun with the presupposition of capital, capital appears to have vanished as a formal relation, then this can have taken place only because the invisible threads which draw it through the process have been overlooked. Now, I'm very taken with this idea of invisible threads. And I think that one of the things you might do when you're reading the Grundrisse is to learn to look at certain invisible threads which actually run throughout the whole text. And you know, when I'm reading it, I kind of go, oh, okay, we saw that somewhere. And there's both a history to the invisible threads, a deep history, which we will be looking at later on, but also there's a theoretical question of how these invisible threads come together at various points to actually create a different kind of world. And I think that in this section, Marx, a couple of things happen. One is that he's going to define the theory of surplus value. And then after a while, he starts to try to convince himself of how the theory of surplus value works. So he works on lots of numerical examples. So from about page 340 to pretty much the end of this, there's a lot of arithmetic examples. And I'm recommending that you not bother to read all of that if you don't want to. Now, if you're really, really excited and want to go and read it, and then you can come back and tell me what is new and interesting in all of these things that he puts together, then be my guest. And the funny thing is, Marx himself gets impatient about this, because in the opening of the next section, he doesn't talk about invisible threads. He talks instead about the highly irksome calculations. And he says they will not delay us any further. And then he goes on for 5 or 6 pages of even more irksome calculations. So when you get passages like this, you have to, I think, just put your head down and glance over it and see, well, okay, and see what he's doing. In effect, what he's doing is saying, well, okay, the surplus value is being created by labor working for a longer part of the working day. How much of the total capital is going to labor? How much of it is going to means of production? What's the rate of exploitation under different capital labor ratios and so on? So he just adds up and kind of says, when it is divided 40 to 60, it looks different than when it's divided 20 to 80, and things look different. So it's just like that, and it's like he's convincing himself somehow or other that this is a viable framework. So this is another thing that happens in the text. But, and here is, I think, perhaps the point I would really want to make very strongly indeed. Up until this point, Marx has been he's got this idea, which we've seen from the plans for capital, of expanding the terrain, if you like, of what he's looking at, and those plans are, I think, extremely extensive, and of course he never completed them or even got anywhere close to completing them. So there is that side to it. But at the same time, he's in effect beginning to sort of converge on some point where you can actually say, well, this is what the Grundrisse is really about. And this convergence, for me anyway, is set on page 331, where he says this: the exact development of the concept of capital. And I'm going to argue that that is one of the major themes of what the Grundrisse is about. And if you study the Grundrisse, you should come out at the end with a very good understanding of the exact development of the concept of capital. This, he says, is necessary since it is the fundamental concept of modern economics. All classical political economy was really wrestling with the question how to understand capital and what capitalism was about and what capital does and why it does it in the way it does it. So the exact development of the concept of capital is necessary, since it is the fundamental concept of modern economics, just as capital itself, whose abstract, reflected image, its concept is the foundation of bourgeois society. So if you want to understand the concept of capital, and you want to understand bourgeois society, you have to put those two together and say, I'm going to understand the structure of bourgeois society through an understanding of the concept of capital, because the concept of capital is foundational for how bourgeois society works. And he then goes on to say, the sharp formulation of the basic presuppositions of the relation, that is, between capital and labor, must bring out all the contradictions of bourgeois production, as well as the boundary where it drives beyond itself. So there's if you like, a mission statement. What Marx is desperate to do is to understand what is capital. And it's interesting, you see, because if you go to somebody well, I can go to you and say, what is capital? How did you understand capital? And nearly always people will give you an answer which is about a thing. Or it's a stock of machines, or it's a stock of this or a stock of that, But Marx obviously has a rather different definition of capital. It's not a stock of machines. Important those stocks of machines are. And it's not a pile of money either. What it is a very, very distinctive social relation. And that is then getting us to the question of the invisible threads. That it's a social relation. But social relations you can't measure directly. I mean, people kind of say, oh, well, how come Marx is talking about economics in a way which is outside of measurement? Because most economists basically figure if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. Whereas Marx is saying the foundational argument here is something which is outside of direct measurement. It is an invisible thread. And therefore, we must get away from this idea of capital as a definable thing and a definable quantity and start to talk about the invisible thread. And the invisible thread is largely set out in the following kind of way, because he says that having laid this, he then starts to talk on 307, 308, actually more on 308, 309. When he starts to kind of say that he's really going to be talking about the self-contradictory notion of and self-dissolving notion of and he kind of says on 309, even economists, e.g. Ricardo, Sismondi, etc., who accept that only labor is productive and not capital, but then they do not conceive capital in its specific character as form, as a relation of production reflected into itself, but think only about its material substance, raw material. But these material elements do not make capital into capital. That is, there is no physical materialist definition of what is capital, which is possible. And that, of course, then says that there's some other way in which we should think of it. And he cites Say. Now, Say is somebody who Marx really didn't like at all. And in Capital and elsewhere, Say's law comes to fiercely under attack from Marx. But here he's agreeing with when Say says, capital is always an immaterial essence. Immaterial essence. Because it is not material which makes capital, but the value of this material, a value which has nothing corporeal about it. Capital, says Say, is a commercial idea, and that comes close to an idealist interpretation. But Marx is not offering an idealist interpretation. What he's offering is a social relation definition. That actually value is a social relation. And value is going to be a key to understanding what is capital. But value cannot be measured directly. I mean, Marx likes to calculate things in fictional values, but you can't measure it directly. It has a representation, which is the money form, but the representation is not named the same thing as value. And if you kind of say this, it sounds hard and that, but actually it's a very commonplace kind of problem. If, for example, we wish to understand something about why Donald Trump is so influential in politics or something, we can cite all kinds of material things about how much money he's got, how much this he's got, how much of that he's got, all those things. But at a certain point, there comes a point where things like charisma, personal, capacity, a sense of things. In other words, it's the immaterial side of him, which actually explains a lot about, and which makes the source of his power very mysterious. All the commentators on CNN and MSNBC go around kind of saying, well, it's hard to explain why Donald Trump is still important. His university was a disaster. He's been fined by this. He's got all of those kinds of things, and he's still somehow or other powerful. And we can't do a lot of things we want to do because of that power. And you kind of say, well, this is immaterial. This is immaterial, but Marx then adds, it's immaterial but objective. It's immaterial, but it has objective consequences. And that's exactly how you would have to approach something like explaining the Donald Trump phenomenon. It's very hard to do, but it is immaterial. And this is the invisible thread which Marx is going to be looking at is the notion of capital as value. Somehow or other, value has something to do with it. That he doesn't really bring this to full fruition. But it is here where he's kind of saying, and just so if anybody asks you what's capital, one of the first things you do is to say, well, material elements do not make capital into capital. And it's not a material question. And you can't measure it. And that's one of the reasons why economists never read Marx, because Marx is saying you can't measure the most important thing that we need to know. And as far as economists are concerned, like I say, they've really got into this idea, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. So, they do not understand Marx's theory of value, nor notions of contradiction, or those things. But it actually, the reason I'm kind of saying day-to-day analysis, we're using this kind of way of thinking all of the time. And it's very important politically. And it has all kinds of effects. And so what happens with capital is very much of that sort. It has its representations. Representations of Donald Trump's popularity can be found, for example. And the representations of how much money there is floating around going into, say, real estate development can be measured. So there are certain things that can be measured alongside of the immateriality. So it's not as if somehow or other the immateriality lives up there, and is not in any way connected to the material. So there's an immaterial-material relation. The immaterial is important to the degree that it actually explains a lot of things, but it has objective consequences, and through the objective consequences, you can feed back into understanding what the nature is of the immateriality. So the immaterial-material relation is going to be central to everything that Marx does from here on. And he tries to give if you like, a sense of firmness, and this is part why we get all these crazy numbers coming up in what follows, because having defined things as being immaterial, he's got to reassure people that, well, yeah, okay, on the basis of the immateriality, you can say something, so that you can say, for example, that if the surplus value is 20 and the labor input is 20, then the rate of exploitation is 100%. And so he's not saying the immaterial takes it out of any kind of, but I think he wants to reassure himself that his whole argument is grounded, even though it's immaterial, and that it's grounded but material. So I think this is just a very important aspect of what Marx is doing, and why he's doing it in the way he's doing it. And the other thing that happens here in this section is that we go in, as we will in a minute, to the production of surplus value, which is the origin of profit. We go into all of that, and we start to sort that out, and we get a good sense of it. And notice what we've done. We started with the money circulation. We then got into sort of money as capital, and now we've got into, the capital-labor relation, and now we've got into the production of surplus value and the production of what it is that grounds profit, which is the creation and appropriation of surplus value. So we've got to that point. But Marx doesn't stop here. Remember these two words about what's presumed and what's posited. In order to get here, a lot has been presumed. And Marx talks in here several times about, well, we have to presume that there is a labor force available which is working for a wage. So wage labor is already there. There is a sophisticated commodity market there also. So all of these things are presumed. And out of that presumption comes this identity of capital as value, which gradually is being, if you like, pictured as coming into our vision as being the core of what capital is really all about, even though it's not clearly measurable. But the story does not stop there. Everything, as he says, that has a presupposition also posits something. And it's interesting, I think, to say, well, in this section, which is the meaningful part of which is mercifully rather short before you get into all the calculations that you can ignore. But he right towards the end, he actually then starts to talk about something that is posited. And this is, I think, a rather stunning idea. And let me read this to you. This is on page 367. Okay. In order to function as capital, value has to have a material form, and that material form is, of course, money capital. So, Marx then says, money, then, insofar as it now already in itself exists as capital, is therefore simply a claim on future labor. A claim on future labor. What that means is that if I have this money, I can go and buy labor power. And I can buy the capacity to labor. And therefore money is inherently a potential claim upon future labor. Right? Because what Marx is doing is saying you have to understand capital as a circulation process. It's going from money to commodity to productive form to commodity to money back into productive form. So it's going round in cyclical form. And as we mentioned last time, it actually is doing it in such a way as to construct a spiral. So money is doing all of those things. And that means that value is coursing through all of these different material representations. Here it's represented by the money. Here it is represented by the commodities. Here it is represented by production. Here it is represented by the new commodities. Here it is represented again in money form, and it goes back round. So it's money appears to be the linchpin of this. It is the representation of value. But value is not the same as money. But the person who has some money can get into that circuit and make a claim on labor. So it is a claim. Money is simply a claim on future labor. It exists objectively merely as money, surplus value, the new growth of the objectified labor, to the extent that it exists for itself, is money. That is, you only know you've got surplus value when you've got money as profit at the end of this sequence. But now it is money which in itself is already capital. That is the distinction between money and money capital. Money capital is money which is used in a certain way. It's money which is used in that circuit process. If it drops out of that circuit process, it's no longer capital, it's just money and can be used as money. But when it enters into it, it's because it's like using money as a claim on future labor. As such, he says, it is a claim on new labor. Here, capital already no longer enters into relation with ongoing labor, but with future labor. That is, the system is a spiral. It's got to expand. So it's got to have an access to a surplus labor force. The presupposition is when you go into the labor market is there are unemployed laborers there. And each time you go around, you're expanding more. So each time you expand, so there's going to be more laborers there. It no longer appears dissolved into its simple elements in the production process, but as money. No longer, however, as money which is merely the abstract form of general wealth. Now notice that we're beginning to say something extra about money we've got to understand here. But as a claim on the real possibility of general wealth, labour capacity, and more precisely, labour capacity in the process of becoming. That is that circuit of labour capacity. He's already thinking about it. This is coming in the, at the outset. And this is going to tell you something about where he might want to go. As a claim, its material existence as money is irrelevant and can be replaced by any other title. That is, if I've got assets of some kind, I can actually convert them in such a way as to make the claim upon future labour. Like the creditor of the state, this is an interesting comment, every capitalist with his newly gained value possesses a claim on future labour, and by means of the appropriation of ongoing labour, has already at the same time appropriated future labour. This side of capital to be developed to this point, but already here, its property of existing as value separately from its substance can be seen. This already lays the basis for credit. Now, already at this point, Marx is saying that actually implicit in this process of surplus value production and the circulation and so on is money suddenly takes on this other thing of being a claim on future labour, and then it becomes so much of a claim on future labour that is as it underpins the credit system. In other words, this whole argument which is going on in this section posits, let's use that word, Marx doesn't use it, but I'll use it, posits the creation and formation of a distinctive credit system. This is already implicit in his argument, right? So he's saying when we get to this thing about what's the nature of capital, and he's saying the nature of capital is that it's at some point or other it's going to produce surplus value and it's going to use money in certain kinds of ways, and in so doing makes claims on future labour, and the real claim on future labour is going to be exercised through the credit system, because the credit system is what the claim on future labour is all about. That's already in the line of thinking. So when you ask the question, what's capital, he'll kind of say, well, it's this whole kind of process. And one of the invisible threads is the invisible threads that passes from what is arguing here in capital and what he's going to say about the credit system whenever he gets to it. Well, he only gets to the credit system in volume 3. and a little bit comes in there. But watch out for little things like this. What is it that the creation of surplus value in the spiral form, what is it that it posits? And one of the things it posits is, as we go down further, it posits, of course, fixed capital formation, circulation of interest-bearing capital, state debt and the circulation of state debt, and all those things will all come in. And that is what capital is. So it's an expansive definition. It's not as if somehow or other, at this point in the beginning of this section here, when he defines what capital might be as value, it's not, at this point, it's not, he doesn't actually sort of get into the credit system, but you can see why all of this posits the existence and the creation of a credit system. This is important to me because a lot of people started to talk about, capital's taken on a financial form. The financialization of capital has taken place. The power of finance is everywhere, and this has all happened since 1980, so we're in a new phase of capitalism. All right, I mean, the kind of thesis about the financialization of capitalism is very strong in Marxist circles, but of course it's very strong in bourgeois economics. Everybody goes off now and studies finance rather than, production. The CEOs of the major corporations went from being engineers who knew something about cars to being financiers who knew a lot about finance. So what this says to me is none of that should be surprising to us. That we should actually recognize that to the degree that the rise of a credit system and the use of money as a claim on future labor, that it was implicit at the very beginning, and that it therefore posited the existence of the credit system and the development, well, it took a long time coming. Actually, it was already in motion when Marx was there. In other words, I would argue against the idea that we are in a new phase, a completely different theoretical framework from the one which Marx laid out. No, he had the theoretical framework here already set up to say, well, we have to study these claims on future labor, and what these claims on future labor might be alike. But he then kind of says, well, I'm not in a position to do that here. I can't do that right now because I've got a lot of other stuff I've got to do. So I've got to get back to my main business here, which is trying to explain where surplus value comes from, what the consequences are. But when you're reading it, it seems to me very always useful to sit back and say, where am I in Marx's unraveling of the invisible thread? And the invisible thread. Where are we? How far down the line are we? And what does it mean when we don't properly recognize what it is that is being posited by what is actually happening in the here and now? And Marx is, I think he's devastatingly precise and at his most interesting in little phrases like this, where he kind of says, well, you think you know what capital is, but hey, there's a whole bunch of things here that have got to be studied. And of course, he doesn't get around to being able to do it, except somewhat, reluctantly in the manuscript that led into Volume 3 of Capital. So these are some of the features of this section. And let me just stop here actually and ask if you've got any kind of comments you want to make about this, because I'm talking globally rather than about the specific text, and you may want to create an argument for or against it, whatever. Can we get the microphone? Sorry. I guess that
I just want to make a comment. It's like the perpetualization of invisible power relations. That's just a comment. I don't know what's that worth saying, that the battleground is invisible and Marx is locating himself on the battlefield of invisible power relations. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, but it's power relations with objective consequences, and that therefore you can say something about the nature of those power relations, which is, I think, what he's concerned with here. Yeah.
Thanks. Could you say something more about this status of the social relation that is value being immaterial and so immeasurable? If that's sort of the case, why does he spend so long trying to calculate? Like, I'm just interested in that relationship of, or that question has always been puzzling to me, whether value is something that he thinks can be measured and so can be studied by political economy, or is essentially something that can't be really.
Yeah, this is one of the contradictions of Marx's own approach. Having said that it's immeasurable and the rest of it, in the later part of this chapter, he spends a lot of time saying, well, there's 10 units of value here and 20 there and 30 there and so on. And on that basis, what we have is certain consequences. I think the answer is this, that he felt he could create fictional numbers which would help him understand certain features of the dynamics of a situation and what might be likely objective consequences, so that he will look at the objective consequences of technological change by saying that technological change has an impact upon the ratios of labor inputs to means of production. Okay, and that when you've got when you increase the social productivity of labor, you need fewer laborers. Now, laborers are the source of surplus value. Therefore, you're going to have less surplus value. And if you have less surplus value, you're going to end up with a lower rate of profit. So he can make those calculations and say, therefore, there is an inherent tendency for technological change to create a situation in which the rate of profit is going to fall. So he can make that argument. But he can only make that argument by setting out these fictional numbers and making assumptions. For example, in the scenario I've just painted, one of the assumptions he makes is that the rate of exploitation of labor is constant. That if the rate of exploitation of labor is constant and you have less labor, then you're going to have less surplus value. On the other hand, you can increase the rate of exploitation. So even though you've got fewer laborers, if you've got an increasing rate of exploitation, you can end up in the same position as you were earlier. So he can play with the possibilities. The difficulty is, I think, not so much with how he's working with them, but how this is interpreted in the public. And in the public interpretation of that is, well, Marx said, you've got 20 units of value which is going to wages and 80 which is going to means of production, and there's 20 units of surplus value. It's a very real thing. And people start to treat the numbers as reality. And I think it's important to recognize, this is the way I would look at it, that the numbers help him to talk about certain possibilities, so that, for example, how did he get to the law of the falling rate of profit? By playing with these numbers and showing that increasing the social productivity of labor, other things being equal, which they never are, of course, but other things being equal, will produce a falling rate of profit. Which then poses the problem of why would capitalists engage in technological change when the impact of technological change is to decrease the profit rate? It is irrational. And Marx has to answer that contradiction. So how does he do it? He kind of says, well, it's because of the coercive laws of competition. That individual capitalists seeking to maximize their rate of return will raise the productivity of their labor in the hope that nobody else raises the productivity of theirs, in which case they make super profits. And the pursuit of super profits means that at a certain point everybody else will adopt the same technology, and so you're going to get it. So these are the kinds of arguments he can construct with the help of these fictional numbers. I wish, however, well, of course this is Grundrisse, and so he doesn't have to do this, but I wish even in his published work, he made very clear that these numbers are fictional numbers and they don't have any, and they are therefore really standing in for immeasurable quantities. So that's how I would interpret it. I mean, other people would say I'm wrong, but it's okay. But I think that his use of these numbers was, in here it gets tedious. I mean, even he says, hey, this is pretty tedious. What I'm doing, I don't have to do more of it. But it's a way of, don't treat it as real. You get into trouble if you do that. On the other hand, the tendency towards the falling rate of profit is real. And he came at it by playing with these numbers. Any other?
I have a question regarding the spiral and what you said last time, that it's out of control, and that possibly the meaning of Grundrisse is that Marx wants to tell us what we can do about it, but I am not sure in which direction this can do is going, or in relation to the kind of immersement in capital, and it's like the notions that we are using. What can we do in a way? It seems that it's an entanglement kind of formula. Everything around us, everything in the analysis. I don't know if the question makes any sense. It's more from a little bit remote position. If we can, what is he offering us to do? Is it something that is within capital, or abolishing capital, or changing capital? I know maybe it's a naive question. I don't.
Well, the short answer to that is he doesn't offer anything particular. He just gives you an analysis to clarify what the nature of the problem is.
From what you said last time, that it's different than only description of an analysis. That's why the question. But maybe I misunderstood. Sorry.
Well, I think he's if you recognize that there are many things happening in society which is being driven by capital, and you want to be an anti-capitalist, then you should have a good idea of what capital is. And that's what he's trying to do here, is to say, what is capital? And what is it? Now, one of the things that has happened historically is that, to the degree that Volume 1 of Capital deals with production, and industrial production at that gives you a certain understanding of what the nature of capital is from the Volume 1 perspective. But there's a Volume 2 perspective and a Volume 3 perspective, and then there's a Grundrisse, which goes well beyond what Volume 1 says. For instance, there's nothing in Volume 1 that would hint, like he does here, that the credit system is implicit in, posited in, and that therefore, if you're anti-capitalist, you've got to control the credit system. And with many of these things, you will find, and this has a common sense reading, if you like, that most of the things we find, they're double-edged. That the credit system, for example, is extremely helpful in certain ways for all kinds of reasons. I'll give you one very simple reasons. You know, credit cards are widely used. They were gratefully received by working people, and particularly those with low incomes. I mean, if you didn't have enough money to put food on the table on Thursday, and you had to wait till Saturday before you could buy some food, it's a different story than you didn't have the money on Thursday, but you had your credit card, so you could use your credit card and then recuperate the funds on Saturday when you got paid. So credit cards were a boon for a low-income population. But then they were used in a certain way so that people became so chronically indebted that we now live in a society characterized by debt peonage. So even something like the creation of the credit system is not entirely negative. The credit system allows you to build certain infrastructures long term. And a lot of those infrastructures, I think, are extremely useful, and I think we would not want to see them destroyed. And we're very glad they're built. Some are a waste of time. But my point here is that what that would say is that if you're an anti-capitalist, do you want to destroy everything that goes on through the financial system? Or do you want to engage in certain reforms in the financial system so that it mollifies the prudent wing? We're not entirely wrong in thinking that there's something kind of really wonky about the credit system and it needs reform. What Marx is kind of saying is that it doesn't deal with the foundation of the thing, but almost everything that crops up within a capitalist mode of production has this dual character. That is, it has its positive side and its negative side. And one of the things we then start to do is to think about, well, okay, and we see this in social media. We see this in, we see this everywhere pretty much, right? I mean, our daily experience is things which seem to offer great possibilities and positive being used in highly negative ways, right? So one of the things the analysis does is to help you understand what might be the positive side of the credit system, for example, and why, if you're a socialist, you still might want to have something like a credit system in place in order to deal with certain kinds of issues. And somehow or other you could shut off the predatory practices that exist within the credit system and the debt peonage. We try and deal with that. And we're seeing that, of course, going before the Supreme Court right now with student debt and so on. But again, look at something like student debt. Was this an entirely negative thing? No, it allowed many people to end up with an education and to have a good career in something, and it was, it did to some degree help democratize, but then it became this huge social burden. So again, what Marx is doing here is trying to give you an analysis to tell you why it is that this duality exists. And that things that look like they're great and good and that somehow get perverted into something that's horrible and the like. So the main thing I think that Marx is concerned with is to try to make sure that when we're battling against something like capital, we understand what it is that we're battling against. So when he says in this section, we must know the nature of what capital is, because capital is the foundation of bourgeois society, and we have to understand its contradictions and what its capacities is for actually mapping a socialist future. What aspects of capital would we want to keep? And how would we want to keep them? And what are the dangers? And this is a theme, I think, that comes out in the Grundrisse quite a bit. Yeah, somebody over there.
Well, I actually was just going to ask about exactly what you were just bringing up, was about the concept of the contradictions within capital and within bourgeois society. I think if you think you've said enough about it, then we could skip over my question. But I still grapple with that concept as it gets introduced in this writing and in your commentary, and trying to understand like on what field we are to like measure or identify these contradictions or what they are, and perhaps like some more examples could illustrate this in a way that would make them more easily identifiable. I mean, maybe it's just that we've been living in capitalism our whole lives, so we don't see them, or we don't like think of them as contradictions, perhaps. But I've struggled with that concept, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about it.
Well, only that, keep on struggling. I mean, I struggle with it too. I mean, the point is that the analysis, it seems to me, and why I find the Grundrisse such an interesting text is that what you find in it is, things about invisible threads and so on that you start to you get sensitized to in the course of the text, which would then help you understand why it is that the purpose of a certain political intervention was X, but the result was actually Y, unintended consequences. And the unintended consequences often flow from the nature of the contradictions within. And I think getting the structure of contradictions into some kind of shape is a worthwhile endeavor. Further on I'm anticipating a bit further on, in the Grundrisse, Marx introduces the figure of the emancipated laborer. And basically kind of says, what would the emancipated laborer think about all of this? And what would they do in the light of this understanding? And I like that idea. It's not as if emancipation in the head is all that really matters. Obviously, emancipation is important in terms of daily work practices, labor practices, market practices, and all the rest of it. So there's a realm of practices which need to be addressed. But at a certain point, also, the mental conceptions of the world have to be sharp enough to capture what is going on. And when Marx introduces this idea of the emancipated laborer, I think, well, okay, let's suppose the laborers have a movement and everybody is emancipated in their mental conceptions to have a clear understanding of what the nature of the problem is. And it's a kind of it's an idea I have about sort of somehow they're writing a pedagogy of the emancipated laborer. What would you need, and what do you need to know about what capital is in order to fight against it effectively, and in order to also understand how so many of the problems that we're experiencing are derived, and this is again the point Marx is making, that capital stands at the center of the nature of bourgeois society, and there's nothing really important going on in bourgeois society that doesn't have some ramifications derived from circulation of capital. And if that's the case, then we have to understand exactly what those derivations are. I know that sounds a tall order, but on the other hand, we live these contradictions. And that's a very challenging thing, exciting thing, depressing thing if you get overwhelmed by it, which is very easy to do. But, But again, all I'm hoping here is that in this text you're going to think about the invisible threads and think about some of these relations. Any more comments on these general themes? Yeah.
There's a lot of interesting threads, but maybe the simplest question would be, in the first session, I think you talked about the theory of value that Marx has in Grundrisse, and this kind of indiscernibility, whether he's sort of deriving from Ricard and other kind of economists, or he's trying to overturn it. And I wonder where this discussion now around value, if that gives us any kind of possible hints of what is a theory of value that he's working on, and how much of it is still under the influence, and how much of it is in this text offers a possibility of getting out.
Yeah, in this text, the theory of value is not clarified adequately. Again and again, Marx makes some comment about capital and value, and my response is, yeah, it's great. And then he puts in brackets exchange value. He can't and doesn't, for the most part. Occasionally he does, but for the most part, he does not separate value from exchange value. And exchange value is the material form. Value is the immaterial form, and somehow or other he's got them very close together. So that the abandonment of the law of value, which he advocates at a certain point, actually arises as if exchange value is going to disappear. And you think of that and you think, well, that's pretty crazy. It's not as if, the market system can entirely disappear in a socialist society. There's going to have to be some market somewhere. And market practices are likely to carry on. But his point is that since value theory is the problem, and he associates it so closely with exchange value, I think he gets a blurred vision as to what the possibilities are. Okay, let's go back to the text and just deal with his theory of surplus value to make sure that everybody is clear on this. There was one other thing that is set up in here which we can deal with very briefly. There is this long footnote on page 305 about productive labor and Adam Smith. And that comes back on page 329 when he starts talking about the actors. Actors are productive workers, not insofar as they produce a play, but insofar as they increase their employer's wealth. He does clearly shift here from the idea that the definition of productive and unproductive labor is about material qualities, to saying productive labor is all that labor which produces surplus value for capital. The problem with this, however, is that there are people who are indirectly involved in productive labor, and what do you do about that? For instance, the definition of productive labor in capital is very much about the factory. So you say the factory is a site where all the laborers are productive laborers. You then go and say, well, what happens down the line when, the factory work is going on there, but you subcontract cleaning, or you subcontract something else? I mean, are the cleaning people now who used to be classified as productive laborers because they were part of the factory labor, they're now unproductive because they're not making anything, they're just cleaning up the mess? So increasingly what Marx does is he talks, every talk about the socialization of labor, you end up with this notion that the individual qualities of the labor are what defines what is productive. You have to move away from that to talking about the productivity of collective labor and the definition of collective labor. So that everybody working in the factory, including those doing the cleaning, is part of the collective labor of the factory. But then you've then got the kind of problem of what do you do about people who provide coordinating functions between, say, subcontracted work done in the automobile industry, producing auto parts and so on. How is that all coordinated? What do you do? So actually, Marx, towards the end of his life and career, was less and less concerned with this distinction between productive and unproductive labor. And more, and he's very explicit here, productive labor is that labor which contributes to the wealth and well-being of capital. So if you're a rock star, you're going to be productive labor if the promoter makes megabucks from putting you into a concert, you know. So you get into that kind of thing. So Marx gradually abandons this whole discussion of productive and unproductive labor, but you can see where it comes from, which is in the 18th century, there were large segments of the working population who were not engaged in producing surplus value for capital. The butlers in aristocratic households, things like that, cooks in aristocratic households and so on. And if you look at the census during Marx's time, the largest category of labor was domestic service. And the main were textiles and steel and things like that were the main productive sectors, but they've employed fewer people than the domestic labor. So at that time, Marx was prepared to kind of say, well, domestic laborers are not productive workers. Domestic work could be organized capitalistically by firms, and is now organized capitalistically by firms who get surplus value out of domestic labor. But in Marx's time, that wasn't the case. So what we find is this discussion of Adam Smith and workers, because in Adam Smith's case, and again he goes back to say, or actually it's Nassau Senior, productive labor is only that which produces capital. And this was going to be accepted. Senior, however, thought this was crazy because this meant that the piano player was not a productive laborer, whereas the piano maker was, and this was absurd economics. But this is the sort of thing you get into when you come up with some categories that make sense at a certain historical moment, and then later on things shift in such a way as to make them kind of so almost impossible to utilize. But there is a kind of considerable discussion these days about the parasitic aspects of rentier activities. To what degree is our society actually increasingly dominated by parasitic forms of labor and parasitic forms of capital? This is something which is being debated in New Left Review and various other places right now, if you're interested in that discussion. But the return of the rentier has been an important theme over the last 20 or 30 years. Because in the 18th century, somebody like Saint-Simon would take the view that both the productive people, best to call it that way, the productive people were the capitalist entrepreneurs and the workers. The unproductive workers were those who were employed by the state, by the church, by the military, in law and so on. And so in 18th century society, you'd look at many aspects of what was going on and say it's all parasitic. And real wealth is only being produced by entrepreneurs and their workers. To which you could then also add the agricultural interests as the physiocrats and so on. So, but productive and unproductive labor is briefly mentioned here, and I don't want to spend too much time on it. Now, I guess most of you are familiar with the theory of surplus value, right? i.e. that the problem of how in a society which is characterized by equality in exchange as a rule, doesn't actually apply, but it's considered a rule. How can you get a surplus when equality of exchange is being assured? And that leads to the first conclusion, is that it cannot possibly come from market exchange. That is, market exchange is not a source of surplus. Even though there was a time when buying cheap and selling dear was a source of profit, which was the mercantilist world that existed prior to the rise of industrial capitalism. But in industrial capitalism, that would not be the case. So we have then the requirement that capital find upon the market a commodity which has the capacity to produce more value than it itself has. And that value and that commodity is labor power. You pay the laborer its value, which is the cost of the production of its sustenance, how much food it needs and shelter and clothing and all the rest of it. So you can set up the idea of a datum, which is a certain value of labor power. And that value of labor power is then what the capitalist has to pay. So the capitalist pays that value of labor power in order to get the capacity, the control over the capacity to labor. Having done that, then the capitalist will work to create value. And at a certain point, the value equivalent of the value of labor power will be reached after, say, 4 or 6 hours of work. And then you work the labor another 3 or 4 hours or 6 hours or whatever, and that is free gift. In other words, that's free labor, which the capitalist is in a position to extract. Now, this is only going to happen if the only choice that labor has is to go into the wage labor force in order to sustain itself, which gets you into primitive accumulation and the fact that labor is deprived of all access to basic means of production, particularly land. And land came up last time as being, a peculiar quality because, Marx presupposes, rather than posits land rent, that he has to presuppose it, because if it doesn't presuppose it, workers would go, become peasants on the land. And there is this great passage in here about what happened when the slaves were released in Jamaica. This little passage from the Times where the slave owner is complaining that these people didn't go off and work hard. Well, why should they? And he's outraged that they're not working hard. They've lost the capacities of industriousness and all the rest of it. And they just simply want to be peasants, creating their own, they've got their own land, and they just want to live their own lives and don't want to be bothered with working hard and like to sit around and, shoot the breeze and do all those kinds of things, which sounds pretty nice idea for a socialist society. So you kind of say, well, you sort of understand what's going on there. But notice that the dispossessed slave owner is outraged, not only at being dispossessed, but at the fact that the people who went away wouldn't even go into the wage labor force. They just wanted to live on the land and have a good time. and there's this little snippet which occurs in this chapter. But anyway, the theory of surplus value then rests upon capital using labor. But there's an important thing to do here, which is that Marx does this in a certain way. In other words, it's not as if he's saying, well, okay, there's labor over there, and you just pluck it over there and you put it in here, and then that works. That's the bourgeois economic way of looking at things. No, he says follows. We have to look at here at the end of the process of production, which was begun with the presupposition of capital. Capital appears to have vanished as a formal relation. And this is where the invisible threads come in. Capital becomes the process of production through the incorporation of labor into capital. That is, this capital-labor relation is going to be treated in a very, this is the core social relation. And how Marx frames it is very different from how it would be framed as opposed in bourgeois economics. So capital becomes the process of production. Initially, however, it becomes the material process of production, the process of production in general. So it's the material entry of a laborer into a production process. With that, the labor process posited prior to value as point of departure, which owing to its abstractness, its pure materiality, is common to all forms of production, here reappears again within capital as a process which proceeds within its substance, forms its content. In other words, there was a time when labor incorporated in production was simply a material event and could be understood as a material event. And what happens, however, with capital is this material event gets incorporated into this social relation which is immaterial. And then the immateriality of it becomes really significant. Capital, he says on page 305, as that which reproduces and increases its value, is autonomous exchange value. Notice value and exchange value. As the process of realization. Now, we also at this point beginning to talk about capital is not only about production, it's also about realization. Marx, a lot of the time, pushes realization onto the back burner. And he does here for some time. But he is insistent, however, that realization, you can't understand production without understanding realization. And the realization is, of course, realization in the market. That is, production depends upon being able to market your good and get the value for it. So therefore, realization in the market is as important as production for the market. And Marx does here get back to something which is not used very much in Capital at all, which is the idea of use value. A use value for capital, he says on page 306. Labor is a mere exchange value for the worker. Available exchange value. That is, the worker gets the exchange value of their labor power, and they get a wage. Okay. But the use value is they have no use value for it. In other words, the workers lose any use value. And the use value goes entirely to capital. And the use value to capital is that that worker can be put to work to create value and surplus value. And he goes on in 307, the worker therefore sells labor as a simple predetermined exchange value, determined by a previous process. He sells labor itself as objectified labor. That is, he has no subjective control over it. And he or she loses all control over the labor capacity. The labor capacity is in effect the use value which passes over to capital. And this goes on. Capital buys it as living labor, as the general productive force of wealth, activity which increases wealth. It is clear, therefore, that the worker cannot become rich in this exchange, since in exchange for his labor capacity as a fixed available magnitude, he surrenders his creative power, like Esau his birthright for a mess of pottage. Rather, he necessarily impoverishes himself, as we shall see further on, because the creative power of his labor establishes itself as the power of capital, as an alien power confronting him. Now, this idea of alien power, both capital and labor, as we've already seen, are alienated. And it's alienated labor and alienated capital that really come together to form surplus value. As he says, the productivity of his labor in general, insofar as it is not capacity but emotion, real labor, comes to confront the worker as an alien power. Capital, inversely, realizes itself through the appropriation of alien labor. This then leads to a very general kind of configuration of Marx's argument. Thus, all the progress of civilization, and this is where Marx gets into, sweeping generalizations about the social formation and the history of the social formation, all the progress of civilization, or in other words, every increase in the powers of social production, if you like, in the productive powers of labor itself, such as results from science, inventions, divisions and combinations of labor, improved means of communication, creation of the world market, machinery, etc., enriches not the worker, but rather capital. Hence, it only magnifies again the power dominating over labor, increases only the productive power of capital. Since capital is the antithesis of the worker, this merely increases the objective power standing over labor. Capital is the objective power which comes from labor and which is then used to dominate labor. The transformation of labor as living, purposive activity into capital is, in itself, the result of the exchange between capital and labor. So it's an exchange relation, but it is the other realizing itself in the other. And therefore there is a kind of intermingling, as it were, of the alienated practices. Therefore, the question whether capital is productive or not is absurd. Of course it's not. Labor itself is productive only if absorbed into capital. So what happens is that capital pushes labor to higher productivity, then appropriates that higher productivity to make it seem as if the higher productivity is a product of capital. Labor such as it exists for itself in the worker in opposition to capital, that is, labor in its immediate being, separated from capital, is not productive. Nor does it ever become productive as an activity of the worker, so long as it merely enters the simple, only formally transforming process of circulation. And then this gets back to the material elements do not make capital into capital. And the quotations from Say and Sismondi and so on, which we briefly discussed. So out of this comes what Marx kind of talks about, that the way in which we are present at the process of its becoming, that is the becoming of capital. This dialectical process of its becoming, dialectical because it involves the fusion between capital and labor. This dialectical process of its becoming is only the ideal expression of the real movement through which capital comes into being. The later relations are to be regarded as developments coming out of this germ, but it is necessary to establish the specific form in which it is posited at a certain point. Otherwise, confusion arises. Value, he kind of says on 311, enters as subject. Labor is purposeful activity. Labor is organized to produce a higher use value for others. The point is that a higher exchange value is created through labor. In the case of simple circulation, the process ended for the individual commodity by being consumed as use value, and it leaves circulation. But in capital, it's the other way around. The consumption of the use value falls within the economic process, and value is protected. Value is, she then goes on, retained, so that both the value of constant capital and the value of variable capital, which is the wages, is preserved. The value is preserved, but the materiality disappears. This again gets back to the immaterial qualities. The value is maintained and sustained. In fact, living labor becomes absolutely crucial for resurrecting dead labor, past labor. So the past labor, which is embodied in means of production and also within the laborer because of the sustenance of the laborer, that value is resurrected, if you like, and pulled back into, so the value is maintained and the material form slides to one side. This is the crucial, the preservation. And here's again another interesting point. The value of past labor is preserved, but who preserves it? The capitalist doesn't preserve it. The laborer does. And the laborer does it as a free gift. So in fact, the laborer is doing two things. They're not only producing surplus value, they're also preserving past values. So that is why the laborer is so crucial. Marx has some comments about laborers, superintendents, and all the rest of it, which then, after we're wandering around, we get to actually the surplus value. And this was something that in the text, I sort of cited this in the companion and kind of said, Marx could have made this a much simpler argument, but Marx, I don't know, is thinking to himself, and I guess he wants to protect himself with as many subordinate clauses and as many half sentences as possible. So this is how he defines surplus value. The surplus value which capital has at the end of the production process. A surplus value which, as a higher price of the product, is realized only in circulation, but like all prices is realized in it by already being ideally presupposed to it, determined before they enter into it, signifies, expressed in accord with the general concept of exchange value, that the labor time objectified in the product, or amount of labor expressed passively, the magnitude of labor appears as an amount of space, but expressed in notion it is measurable only in time. This is greater than that which was present in the original components of capital. What a sentence. You can't go, why the hell can you just kind of said, well, there's a simple calculation here, which is, labor is preserving value and producing surplus value. To be sure, we assume that value which is being reproduced and the surplus value will be realized in the market. So there's no problem. We assume no problem there. So this is the theory of surplus value. And that then leads into, further discussions about the theory of surplus value. And this is where Marx starts to get into two things, which is all of these relationships between means of production and value of labor power. When he puts it on 374, he says this: surplus value in general is value in excess of the equivalent. The equivalent, by definition, is only the identity of value with itself. Hence, surplus value can never sprout out of the equivalent, nor can it do so originally out of circulation. It has to arise from the production process of capital itself. Important proposition: a surplus value can only be created in production. That leads many people to concentrate their attention on production and forget everything else. But what Marx is also saying, and will say, is that surplus value is only potentially created in production, and it's only potentially so until it is realized in the market. And that it is the unity of production and circulation, or the university of production and realization, which is absolutely crucial to surplus value production and the preservation of value. So this is what Marx is going to say, and I think we have to follow him. The great historic quality, he says on 325, of capital is to create this surplus labor. Superfluous labor from a standpoint of mere use values, more subsistence, and its historic destiny is fulfilled as soon as, on one side, there has been such a development of needs that surplus labor above and beyond necessity has itself become a general need arising out of individual needs themselves. In other words, the realization of value is going to depend upon the increasing needs in the market. If you're making surplus value and you're making more stuff, you've got to have market for more stuff, and people are going to want more stuff. So there has to be a transformation of needs. Again, that's posited in this relationship. So the general need has to be augmented. And on the other side, when the severe discipline of capital acting on succeeding generations has developed general industriousness as a general property of the new species. One of the interesting chapters in Gramsci's prison notebooks is a chapter on Americanism and Fordism, which is about the production of a new kind of laborer, and that Fordism required the transformation in the persona of the laborer, and they had to be industrious and productive in certain ways. And what Marx is saying here, as a precursor really to Gramsci, is, well, it's posited in this process that at a certain point, capitalists will want to increase the productivity of their labor, and to do that, they need to cultivate this industriousness. Now, we came across this idea of industriousness in a preceding section, that within the circulation of capital, circulation of labor capacity, the values which the bourgeoisie is trying to foist on labor are values of industriousness and abstemiousness. That is, you try to save. And the more you save, the more capital will depress wages, because they say if you've got money you can save, then you don't need it to live. And industriousness is the same. So that the bourgeois preaching of industriousness as a virtue for the workers, not for themselves, and abstemiousness for the workers, not for themselves, is part of the total hypocrisy of bourgeois society. And so Marx is signaling some of that here. But there is a problem with the spiral form. Capital's ceaseless striving towards the general form of wealth drives labour beyond the limits of its natural paltriness, and thus creates the material elements for the development of the rich individuality, which is as all-sided in its production as in its consumption, and whose labour also therefore appears no longer as labour, but as the full development of activity itself, in which natural necessity in its direct form has disappeared because a historically created need has taken the place of a natural one. This is why capital is productive, i.e. an essential relation for the development of the social productive forces. This is a bit of an astonishing, you come out with this paragraph saying, hey, capital's a good thing, right? It ceases striving towards, drives labour beyond the limits of its natural paltriness, creates the material elements for the development of the rich individuality, which is as all-sided in its production as in its consumption. I mean, think about that for a moment. Say, well, if you were a labourer back in 1840, and you were a labourer in a parallel position today, which would you prefer? Well, would you like to be back in 1840? Or would you prefer to be in a world with cell phones and all those kinds of things? I think what Marx is saying is that this driving force of capital is producing something. And it's something which cannot be considered all bad. It's going to restructure needs, but possibly going to restructure them in positive ways, but it'll also do it in negative ways, which we talked about a bit earlier. But here in this paragraph, Marx is saying capital's ceaseless striving towards general form of wealth, that is, ceaseless striving to production of surplus value and more surplus value, posits certain consequences. A greater labour force, but also greater configurations of needs. And in a sense, this is what the productivity of capitalist society is about. So at this point you say to yourself, well, I'm not so sure I want to be anti-capital, right? Gives us all these wonderful things. And maybe we could do with something about the inequality and all the rest of it, but labourers, even in the worst situations today, are much better off than they were in 1840. And that's what the right wing will tell you anyway. So you may as well admit it and then say, yes, but there are some serious contradictions here and we need to look at them. And that is a precursor to some things that are going to happen a bit further on, which is Marx hinting that while the production of surplus value is obviously involved with high rates of exploitation, the consequences of that high rate of exploitation, when they're flowing around in the spiral form, produce a different kind of world, and are continually producing a different kind of world. And this endless pursuit, as he puts it in this section, this endless pursuit of growth, endless pursuit of innovation, the endless pursuit. And there are therefore all of these incredible barriers, and she begins to talk about. And on 334, after going through one of these calculations about half and 3/4 and 1/8 and all the rest of it, the capitalist, he says, would have to make the workers work only 3/4 of a day in order to add the same surplus value that of 1/2 or one. However, as representative of the general form of wealth, money, capital is the endless and limitless drive to go beyond its limiting barrier. So the spiral form signals trouble somewhere down the line. Every boundary is and has to be a barrier for it. I mean, boundaries are there to stop you. Barriers are there to be jumped over and circumvented. So the conversion of boundaries into barriers. And every boundary is and has to be a barrier, else it would cease to be capital. The result is that money capital is self-reproductive. It has to reproduce itself. And labor is the means by which it becomes self-reproductive. The quantitative boundary of the surplus value appears to it as a mere natural barrier, as a necessity which it constantly tries to violate, and beyond which it constantly seeks to go. And then this leads, of course, the capitalist to try to increase the productive force of his labor. And to the extent that this implies a shortening of the time required to replace the labor objectified in him, this appears as a lengthening of the time that laborers labor for the realization of capital, for exchange value. So he then talks different lengths of working day and all the rest of it. So the theory of surplus value then is about the interpenetration of capital and labor. Their alien qualities which are caught up in the coming together of capital and labor in the act of production. And that act of production being mobilized to produce surplus value, which then recirculates as more and more surplus value. So the system is going to continuously expand. And we have to therefore reckon with its continuous expansion. So this is the theory of surplus value. Any questions about that? Yeah?
Getting back to what you said earlier.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. Getting back to what you said earlier, I don't understand the term social productivity of labor.
It's the the reason Marx puts social there is because it is something that is not due to nature. It is due to the choice of technology, say. And that therefore there's a difference between the natural conditions under which you might produce something, in which case you're dealing with the free gifts of nature, as Marx calls it, and productivity is given by the circumstances, but capital intervenes in those circumstances and therefore creates a a new technology which is much more productive. So that's why it's social productivity, as opposed to productivity due to variations in natural fertility, for example. We haven't really got to the point of consideration about technology at this point. That will come in later, but social productivity simply signifies that.
I wonder if you could clarify something you said, that workers retain past value. I didn't follow that thread. I wonder if you could clarify.
Well, for instance, if you're making a car and you're using steel, the steel works over there, which is producing steel at a certain value. And that is an input into the cars. And you're preserving the value of that steel by making the car. So the value of the car is what the value of the steel was, and the value of the tires, and what the value of all of the bits were. And then the laborer who comes together and puts all those together preserves the value of all of them. So the value of the car is dated labor. That is which is why Marx calls it objective. That's an objective input. The value has already been created. It's already there. It's congealed within the steel. It's now got to be resuscitated, if you like, by being put into the car, and then it becomes a car, and then it gets purchased and drops out of circulation. But the value of the car continues in circulation. So you're always preserving value as well as making surplus value.
I guess I'm wondering on 325 if the development of like the individuality or richer individuality is pushed onwards, or is something that happens maybe like inevitably. And if it's pushed onwards, like maybe we can say we're better off, but don't the intentions matter as well? Because it's not necessarily so that we can have a rich inner life, but so that capital can be realized in the markets through our increased needs. And wouldn't that also impoverish us as well?
Several times in the Grundrisse, Marx will say things like this. And you would, my response anyway would be to say, well, he's talking about this system which is creating rich individuality. What's wrong with that? That's a pretty good idea. Now, one of the things that you can associate with this is how the division of labor is organized. And historically, capital has gone from production systems that are relatively simple to more and more complex, entailing more and more divisions of labor. And in part, those more and more divisions of labor means there are more specialities, and and people can pick and choose as to whether I want to be a welder, or I want to be this, or I want to be that. So that the division of labor and in contemporary society is radically different from Marx's time, and it could be said that it's much richer. Some people would say that it's much impoverished, because the division of labor right now, you do a little piece of a whole job, you have no idea what the totality is about. Whereas back then, when things were much simpler, the division of labor were not of that sort. But I think what Marx is allowing here is that the organization of the production process and the organization of divisions of labor within, given the changing technologies, produces a world in which specialities of function can occur, which may be much more satisfying to people. That people, and elsewhere, and in Capital, he will say things like, we need to accept the fact that these divisions of labor are potentially liberating for people, and that people can move from one line of production to another. A contemporary situation, for example, is very different from what it was 50 years ago. 50 years ago, it would be very common for a worker to go to a factory at age 20 or age 18 and stay there till they were 60, doing the same task, or maybe moving around a little bit. These days, people are much more peripatetic and precarious and moving around, and some people like it. Some people prefer it that way. Some people kind of find it very onerous. God, I've got to learn how to do that. So again, one of the things that this would require, these forms of divisions of labor would require, will be a certain level of education, as well as industriousness and all of that, a certain level of education, so that people can be literate. I mean, in Marx's day, about 2/3 of the workforce was illiterate. Well, you need people to read instructions, you need people to follow instructions and so on, so you have to have a certain level of education. And that level of education could be such as to open up possibilities. I mean, they might end up at a class on Marx's Grundrisse, for example. And what the hell will happen then? You know. So at several points, Marx is going to make this kind of comment, and this goes with the general idea he has, which you may disagree with foundationally, and some people do, that actually socialism has to be constructed on the basis of what we have right now. And if this is the division of labor right now, I'm still going to want a computer. And if the computer is constructed through divisions of labor all over the place and all over the world, with a commodity chain that goes all everywhere, then how are we all going to get our computers? If in the socialist society we want to have computers and internets and things like that, if we want to do that, then how are we going to organize the divisions of labor in such a way that they're gratifying to the people being engaged upon it, and they're non-exploitative? Are you going to perpetuate some level of exploitation as a result of that? So when Marx is saying these things, which are semi-positive or suggest a positive angle, it's a way of signaling, I think, to the sort of educated labourer that there may be some possibilities here. Don't write it all off. Being anti-capitalist, fine, but then think about how you reorganize the production of an Apple computer, such that it is possible for everybody to have an Apple computer, because it becomes a bit that way these days. But at the same time as you have a labor process, which is, somehow or other, both remunerated well, is well structured, and is. You can see where I'm going with this. I mean, so Marx is taking the view that socialism would have to be constructed out of the remnants of what exists now, and what those remnants look like, and where could we look, and where would the emancipated labourer look. And when I get little phrases like that, I think, okay, what would the emancipated labourer tell me at this point? Which is an interesting exercise to go through and ask that question.
I suppose it's my role today to ask another perhaps naive question about one of the central concepts here that I'm still trying to figure out. But I was wondering if you could say more about the concept of alienation in general in Marx's work. I understand in some ways how it's meant to function within the theory, but I'm just trying to apply it to more concrete examples. And yeah, I mean, alienated labor, alienated capital. What is it that these subjects are alienated from at different phases of this cycle? If you could say more about that, I would appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, there are two ways in which alienation is understood by Marx. The earlier work in the economic and philosophic manuscripts suggested that we were alienated for our own good nature by all sorts of nasty things. It was a kind of idealist view. Marx advanced the concept of species being and says we're a species, assumed that we were humane and benevolent and all the rest of it, but saw that possibility perverted by what capital was doing. So it was a perversion of an ideal. He abandoned that as being idealist. But in the Grundrisse, it takes a different form. It is an objective condition. See, an objective condition, because the worker has the capacity to work and to create and to make things and do things. That capacity is alienated from the worker by in a sense, going under the control of capital. The worker's labor is alienated from the worker. That capacity of creativity is taken by somebody else. So the worker now is not doing what they want. They're doing what the capitalist says they must do.
Because they're not reaping the results of the...
They don't control the labor process. The labor process is constructed by capital. The technology is chosen by capital. They don't control the product because the property right of the product goes to capital, and the property right to the value goes to capital. So capital gets all of those things. And all of those things are taken from the worker. And alienation here means the taking away of something that is terribly important to you. So it's the taking away of that capacity. Now, capital is alienated for two reasons. One is something called the coercive laws of competition force capitalists to do certain things that whether they like them or not. For instance, if capital accepts child labor as something acceptable, and you come along and say, I'm not going to employ child labor, you'll find yourself driven out of business very soon by all those companies that are employing child labor for nothing. So you're partly alienated by the fact that in a market system, abstractions rule, and the abstraction of labor rules. But the second thing, and this is where Marx is very strong here in this section, the second thing is that actually capital is based on surplus value. Surplus value is produced by labor. Actually, the capitalist's whole existence is predicated on labor's capacity to create surplus value. If labor didn't produce surplus value, the capitalists would lose their class position. The whole class would be destroyed. So even the position of being a capitalist is contingent entirely upon the exploitation of living labor in production to produce surplus value. And you may think they produce surplus value because they're greedy. Well, they are greedy. But what Marx is saying is that actually whether they were greedy or not doesn't matter, because they are forced to a situation in which their reproduction individually and also as a class is predicated upon alienating the capacity to labor from the laborer. They are not in control. There is a fear in the bourgeoisie that the workers would take control. I mean, why are the bourgeoisie so paranoid about unions and all those kinds of things? I mean, the least hint, and it strikes terror into the hearts of the bourgeoisie. They can't sleep at night because, somebody wants to create a labor union or whatever. So the life of the capitalist and the persona of the capitalist is built into that situation, which is why Marx is talking about they're alienated too. I mean, he doesn't feel that sorry for them, but at a certain point you feel sorry for them because they can't do anything other than what they do. And actually, it turns out there aren't that very many happy capitalists around. They're a pretty miserable lot a lot of the time. And as for the children of the big capitalists, look what's happened to them. I mean, it's an alienating world. So I think Marx didn't make much of concept of alienation in many of his other works, and Grundrisse is unique in this that a strong emphasis upon alienation, a strong emphasis upon the alienation of the relation between capital and labor is an alienated relation, yet each completes itself in the other. Labor couldn't exist without capital. Capital cannot exist without labor. And each completes itself in the other. And it's an alienating experience all the way around. I think this is, again, Marx is kind of pretty explicit about that. But I think that's a very good question, and it's very important to keep it in mind as you go through. It's again one of the invisible threads. Once when I gave examinations about texts like the Grundrisse, I once asked how many places did you spot the term alienation and what would it mean? So if any of you are looking forward to me setting an examination question at the end of the semester because you haven't turned in your weekly comments, let's think about it. That's alienating. You're damn right, it's alienating.
Before we wrap up, any last comments?
Yes, there's one back there.
We have about one.
Thanks. I just wanted to point out a couple passages where it seems like the idea of alienated labor in the Paris manuscripts and the idea of species being are still there. I mean, the passage that you pointed out on 325 where he says, we have the material elements for the development of the rich individuality that's all-sided. That seems to be sort of some lingering influence of that idea of species being. And then on 310, he points out that, he says, already the fact that it is labor which confronts capital as subject, i.e. the worker only in his character as labor and not he himself should open the eyes. This alone, disregarding capital, already contains a relation of the worker to his own activity, which is by no means the natural one. so in this one, in this passage, he seems to be retaining that idea of the labor worker being alienated from his own labor activity. So it's, you see, like it's some moments that seems to still reappear.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that's right. In the Grundrisse, it generally interpretations, as I say, well, there's a clear break between the economic and philosophic manuscripts and the Grundrisse, but I think you're dead right. There are these passages where there's an overlap and where this idea of species being and the potentialities that exist beyond what it currently exists point towards an unalienated world of labor and living and all the rest of it. I think that's there. So thanks very much for mentioning that. I appreciate that, and I think that's right.
Just quickly, I mean, maybe it's more like a comment to think about it more for next time, but it seems to me that let's say from the critique of feminists, thinking about the reproductive labor, because that section came out when you were talking about, let's say, domestic labor during Marxist time, and as unproductive. So thinking about reproductive labor in general, thinking about also the racial dimension that is obviously underemphasized in terms of enslaved, captive labor. You mentioned Jamaica, but just thinking about the constitutive element of that within the production of capitalism, and not relegating it only to kind of a phase of primitive accumulation. And then the critiques in terms of thinking around constant enclosures that in a way also these free gifts of nature that seem to always emerge through, the continuous forms of this, whatever was called primitive accumulation. It seems to me at the level of gender, the racial dimension, the level of also the relation to nature and the value of that in terms of use values of people who can graze or use the land in different ways, and then the toxification, destruction. I wonder, like, if we look at all these levels or even autonomous critiques in terms of thinking about how the main surplus is actually achieved through the times we're being paid and all the times we're not being paid, while we're constantly producing ideas, thoughts, concepts, images, and then looking at, let's say, places like Facebook or all these social media where kind of surplus value is being extracted, but not in a factory anymore, but in the social life. So in these kinds of levels, it's just all the thoughts that are coming to me in terms of, well, what's left as still, necessary in reading this, and what emerges, because I know that you're aware of all of those levels. So it's not something you can answer today, but it's just, as we're third or fourth session, I'm still, every time we do anything with you or think with you, that's sort of in the background as questions. So I just was sharing it a little bit.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry I don't have answers to all those questions. Marx is, when I kind of say, he's really concentrated on the question of how to understand capital, what capital does, and this is going to take a lot of steps. Many of the steps he didn't get to. Many of things have changed, of course, since his time. So, you're left with a theoretical framework which is in the Grundrisse, which I think is worth understanding because it tells you certain things about the dynamics of capital. And I think, Marx, people often say, Marx doesn't tell us what to do. And that's right, because he doesn't. But I think there's a lot in here that tells us what not to do. That is, to what degree are we sometimes very naive about political possibilities when the nature of the capitalist beast is such that the only way it can be brought down is by a deep dissection of some of its foundational features. And again, what Marx, it seems to me, is trying to do is to identify what those foundational features are. Now, there are, when we talk about the world in general, of course, there are all these other questions which you raise, and I think that they are important questions. Marx doesn't answer them, doesn't address them even. And to that sense, you could kind of say this is a very limited vision of how to understand capital, and in a sense, it is a limited vision. But on the other hand, if you try to study capital without the vision that he has constructed, I think you'll end up making some very serious mistakes. So I think that is the point. It's a difference between a necessary as opposed to a sufficient condition for radical action. What Marx, I think, concerned with is creating the necessary conditions, mental conditions, under which some kind of confrontation can be constructed against the powers of capital. That is what he's doing. And yes, it's a limited purposefulness, and of course it's in the Grundrisse it's written in such a way as to be almost downright incomprehensible at certain points. But on the other hand, I think there is actually a lot of rather worthwhile ideas floating around in here, which are important to consider as part and parcel of our current economic reality. So yeah, we'll have to do another course on all the other things. Okay.
And looking forward to seeing everyone next week for the official launch of the companion to Marxist Grundrisse. Thank you, David.
Thank you.